Hey guys, Blue Forest here. I hope you're well. So I decided to record a video with audio, so we'll see how this goes. But I wanted to talk about masteries. I've gotten some questions about them, and they can be tricky. It can be confusing to know which masteries to use to maximize your potential in the game. So I will just say right off the bat, I'm going to go through my masteries. I'm certainly not going to tell you which masteries to use, but I just want to make some recommendations, give you some things to think about as you strategize how to allocate your masteries. I think the most important thing that you need to do when you're setting up your masteries is to pour the majority of your points into masteries that are going to benefit all of your bots and all of your fights. Because some are definitely more useful than others, and some are much more situational, meaning that they'll only benefit certain bots and certain kinds of fights. So you want to start with those masteries that are going to benefit all of your bots all of the time. And so let's just jump in here. Let's start with the defensive masteries. Now, these are generally thought of to be not as good as the offensive masteries. That's true. But there are some defensive masteries that are useful. I think the overall problem with defense is that the benefits that they provide are often very low. And a lot of these have to be ranked up to see anything even remotely helpful. But if you're smart and you're strategic about it, there are some that might benefit you. So let's just start with health, of course. Putting 1 point into health is great. It adds 2% to your base health plus 70 health. You don't need to rank it up, but 1 point is very helpful. Plenty of players who don't even use the defensive masteries will use health. They'll put 1 point into it. So moving from there, we have armor. I have 3 points in armor right now, which is probably not necessary, but I do feel like it provides some benefit, particularly in difficult content. So if you're doing high level AMs, LOC2, LOC3, sometimes the hardest time slides, it just gives you a little bit of protection. You take a little bit less damage, you survive a little bit longer. All those things can come into play in AMs with helping you to stay alive a little bit longer, conserve more items, and so forth. So putting at least a point into it, I think, can be helpful. And of course, you need to put a point into armor if you want to use full metal. So I have full metal maxed. It's pretty common with experienced players because when you're above 85% health, you take 10% less damage. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually pretty helpful. Especially if you're the kind of player you don't get hit a whole lot, but you might just catch a stray melee or ranged hit. You'll take less damage when you're at high health. And it's also very helpful with healing bots. So if you use a bot like Tronus or Wheeljack, if you drop below 85% health, but then you heal, when you go back above 85%, full metal will reactivate. So I do find it to be pretty worthwhile. And so in the middle of this tree on the left here, okay, we have resist melee, we have crit resistance, we have resist ranged, and energy resistance. Now these four I don't really think are worth it simply because the benefit is just too small. So if you were to rank up resist melee, for example, you'd only be getting up to 5% less damage from melee hits. That's just not worth it. Right? So especially if you're a newer player or if you haven't gotten your dodging game down, you'd make a much better investment by simply getting better at the game, improving your dodging game, get better at evading, better at countering. That would be much more worthwhile than throwing a bunch of points into a mastery to simply take a little bit less melee damage, for example. So I don't really recommend those. That then leads to crit damage resistance. And this one can actually be pretty good. And especially if you plan on using any of these masteries here on the right, because you need to use 10 points in this left tree if you want to activate any of these, like Nano Repair. So crit damage resistance, I do know people who have this maxed out. Obviously, crit damage, it's the most devastating damage in the game, so you get between 6 and 15% less crit damage when you get tagged by crits. That could be meaningful to throw a few points into. Like I said, especially if you're going to be using any of these masteries over here on the right. So let's just jump into Nano Repair. So as you probably know, this mastery is fantastic for Wheeljack and utterly useless for every other bot in the game, which is a shame. If you love Wheeljack, if you use him all the time, you bring him into AMs every day, by all means, rank it up. It'll increase the duration of your shields. It's really good for him, but for every other bot, it serves no real purpose because even at rank 3, you're only getting 400 health recovered over 60 seconds. For a typical rank 5 or 6 bot, that's only 1 or 2% health at most. So it just does not really help most players in that regard. Up here we have Feeding Frenzy. It's a very silly mastery. You can recover health when you fight sharks. You obviously don't fight a lot of sharks in this game, so I wouldn't bother with it. I don't know anybody who uses it. In the middle here, you have Bleed Resistance, and then you have Shock Resistance, and you have Silica Plating, which is basically burn resistance. These three I'm not a big fan of. You have to rank them up for them to be meaningful at all. But more importantly, this is why we have purifiers, right? We have bots like TC and Grim that can eliminate the damage that debuffs do. So I would not bother investing in these three, but that then leads to willpower. Now, this one is good in theory. The problem, though, is that overall, I would not recommend it simply because the health that you can recover when you're debuffed is simply far too low. So if you use MV1, you know what willpower is. But MV1, once he gets ranked up, he can recover up to 35% based on the damage he inflicts. With the willpower mastery, you only max out at 9%. So there's a couple problems with that. First of all, you're only healing when you're debuffed, and a lot of debuffs are pretty short. So if a bot lands a 2 or 3 second bleed or shock on you, you don't have a big window to attack. And even if you do land hits, you have to do huge damage. Special damage, melee crits and so forth in order to have any sort of meaningful healing. I had it at rank 3 for a while. I tried it out. I did not like it because in most cases, I was only able to recover maybe 1 to 2% of my health. Just definitely not worth it, especially since you need to buy the tier 2 mastery cores for this one. It's a lot of energon if you want to rank it up. And so I think if this was better, right, if these amounts were, say, double, this would be a pretty good mastery. But as it is, it's just a much poorer version of MV1's willpower, and I don't think most players would find it very helpful at all. So moving over to the corner here, we have capacitor and we have inhibitor. So inhibitor reduces the power rate of enemies that are stunned or shocked, and capacitor gives you a little bit of power if you are suffering from shock. The problem, though, these are very circumstantial masteries. They're not that beneficial. It's not a big bump in, say, the power rate, for example. I would definitely not invest points into them. So coming down to the bottom tree here, we have enhanced block. So a long time ago when I was a new player, I did use this for a while. It's okay when you're new, but once you get to a point to where you're pretty experienced, you don't get hit all that often, you're only blocking when you need to, I don't think this is worth it at all. It's basically very similar to the block proficiency that a bot like Galvatron or Thundercracker get. A tiny bit helpful, but it's not going to do much, and I certainly would not invest a lot of points into it. The one bot that could benefit, of course, is Jetfire because of all this parrying, but if you're not using him a lot, I just don't think Enhanced Block is really worth it at all. Down here we have Recalibration. It reduces the duration of stuns. The problem, though, is that you have to be stunned for it to work, and more importantly, you have to be stunned multiple times in a fight to see its maximum benefit. I think it's much better to just try to learn to not get stunned as much as possible in the first place. Throwing several points into a mastery that's only going to reduce the duration of a stun, and not very much, by the way, just does not seem worth it at all. And then finally, we have Last Stand. So this is a version of Thundercracker's heavy block, where his block is not broken by, ground heavies, things like that. This could be good. The problem, though, is that even at rank 5, it only activates when you're below 14% health. You're almost dead at that point. If it activated at higher health, it could be decent, but as it is, I definitely don't think throwing points into it is going to make much of a difference for most people. And then lastly, we have Perfect Block, which gives you a 2 to 8% chance to reduce damage to 0 when you're blocking. Now that sounds good, but again, we have to look at the chance. Unfortunately, this one is one of the most RNG dependent masteries in the game. Even at rank 4, you only have an 8% chance to take no damage from blocking, which means it's very rarely going to activate. And of course, if you're blocking a special, it's only a 4% chance. I mean, that is just pretty worthless. It doesn't make sense as a mastery. If they want to have a mastery like this, they should absolutely change it. But I think this would be a very frustrating mastery to use because it would almost never activate. So I would stay away from this one. So that's the defensive tree. Like I said, most experienced players aren't going to use a lot of defensive points. They might use a few like me, or if they want to use something like Nano Repair, they'll use just above 10. But there are a few here and there that can be useful if you have a specific purpose in mind to use it. So let's head over to offense. And so we have damage. Of course, you want to put a point into it. It gives 1% to your attack rating. You do not need to rank it up because it would only be a minimal increase in your damage. But 1 point is helpful, of course. Sequencer. Very good mastery. I like it a lot. It does not need to be ranked up, but I feel like it is beneficial. You are obviously launching specials at the end of combos pretty frequently, and getting that extra 9% damage is really nice. This is one of those masteries that you're going to be using all the time, so I feel a few points, if not ranked up, is very worthwhile with Sequencer. Courage is certainly a debated mastery. It's very good in the sense that you get up to 17.5% attack every time you fall below 50% health, and that doubles when you fall below 10% health. Some people don't really like it, or they feel like they don't need to put many points into it because if you are a really good player and you don't get hit that often, you might not feel a whole lot of benefit from it. However, again, if you're doing really difficult content like high-level AMs, even the best players do get hit sometimes, and this just gives you a nice layer of protection, and the fact that it activates every time you fall below 50%, no matter who you're using, I think it's worth a few points, even if you don't rank it up all the way. So at the top and bottom here, we have Counterpunch and Gunslinger. These are very similar, right? So you get a little bit of extra attack when you sidestep a projectile or a melee hit. These are debated as well. They're good. Some people love them. Some people think they're useless. I think they're in between. I have used them before. The only downside, though, is that the extra attack that you get when you counter is pretty minimal, especially at low rank. It's 6 to 8%, and it only applies to the next hit that you do. It's not for a time duration. It's not for the rest of the fight. It's only for your next attack, and so it's not a huge difference, but if you feel like it'll be useful to you because it will activate often given how much you sidestep and then counter, it might be worth a point or two. I would just be careful about maxing it out. You want to make sure you'd have enough points for something like that. And so in the middle here, we have Pierce Armor. It's a little bit of armor penetration. Most people just put a single point into it in order to unlock the crit masteries. You do not need to max this out for sure. And so that leads to crit rate. This is one of the toughest, one of the most annoying, but also great masteries at the same time. Because crit rate is obviously very important. Crits are the biggest damage dealers in this game. They're really important. The problem, though, is that at rank 5, you're only doing an additional 4.5% crit rate. That isn't much. It's a very minor difference. It's not significant. So a lot of people, including myself, don't feel like it's worth investing 5 points into. So right now I only have it at rank 1, so it basically gives me an extra 1% crit rate. If you have a couple extra points, it's certainly not going to hurt. I just wish that the chance of all these was a bit higher. So that leads to crit damage. This one is excellent. I think that everyone should use it. Obviously, you're using this all the time. Crits are really important. This can be used in every fight. And so at rank 5, you're getting 15% additional crit damage. That's really good. So I would put at least a few points into crit damage because it'll be very useful very frequently. And so finally, though, that leads to sniper. I have a point in sniper because you get up to 8% additional damage and block penetration depending on the distance from the opponent with your range shots. There are people who have this ranked up. That could be useful if you really love to use ranged bots. So if you're using bots like RC, Shockwave, Wasp, Starscream, Blaster, bots that really rely on ranged hits, you could definitely invest in this one. Otherwise, though, a single point is very worth it considering that you are firing range shots a lot in this game. So it's a pretty good mastery overall. And so that takes care of this tree. Let's move over to the right and we have Starseeker. This is also a very debated mastery. It's certainly very good. It's used in every fight. It's a passive mastery, so your attack rating just builds depending on how many hits you have. And obviously, if you're a very good player, if you're a ninja-like player, you don't get hit much, this is very worth using and even maxing out. The only problem, of course, is that you only see the maximum benefit at 100 hits. Most fights in the game aren't that long. And also, if you get hit even once, you lose it and you have to start over again. With that said, though, I do think it's still worth it as long as you're a pretty good player and don't get hit very often. Because one misconception with Starseeker is that it only activates at 100 hits, which is not true. You see the maximum benefit at 100 hits, but it starts to work as soon as the combo meter begins. And so you're still going to see a real attack boost at 50 hits or 20 hits. And so once you're a pretty good player, I think it's worth at least a point or two. Whether you rank it up really just depends on what your preferences are. And so that leads to Unfazed. This is a great mastery if you play the right side of AMs. It's also useful in time slides with evade lanes, evade bots, and LOC because it gives you some protection with evade bots. So if you rank it up, you get an 85% attack boost to your next hit after the opponent evades. But more importantly is the defensive capability. Because when the enemy evades, you have a 50% chance to go unstoppable for a second. And that's super helpful. Because if you're fighting a bot like Sideswipe or one of the Bs who tend to evade very frequently and randomly, if you're in the middle of a combo and Sideswipe evades you and then he ends up countering you and doing a ton of damage, that's really frustrating. When Unfazed activates, then Unstoppable gives you a second to sort of get out of the way, right? To ensure that you dodge the counter, which is almost always going to be coming. So Unfazed is great for evade bots. The only thing I would say, though, is that it really needs to be ranked up. You want it at least at rank 4. Anything below that, it's just not going to activate often, and it's going to seem too random. But it's a great mastery overall. Up here, we have two sort of trade-off masteries. So we have Glass Cannon and we have Double Edge. So Glass Cannon is popular with experienced players. I may use it at some point, but it is a trade-off, right? So you're gaining attack, you're sacrificing a little bit of health. Obviously, if you're a good player, getting an extra 7% or so attack might be worth it. But you have to think about whether you're willing to sacrifice 7% health as well if you want to rank it up. But it's a good mastery overall. Double Edge, though, is a far more situational mastery. It's only useful for purified boss and particularly for Beast Wars teams because you need to be able to purify the bleeds at the start of the fight. So if you are a hardcore Beast Wars guy and you use them all the time, this might be worth it. You do gain up to 18% attack, and the bleed will be nullified when you purify it. But unless you're using Beast Wars all the time, it's just not worth it at all because you'd end up taking a lot of bleed damage in many circumstances. So that leads then to Stand Together. You get between 3.5% and 6% attack, which can be multiplied depending on how many team members you still have alive when you fight the final boss in solo and alliance missions. And so currently that would be when you fight, say, Necro. I don't really think it's worth it. It's only useful against one bot, and the attack boost isn't all that great. So putting a bunch of points into it, I wouldn't recommend, but if you really feel like you need it, if you have trouble with final bosses a lot, it might be worth investing in. That then takes us to Assassin. This is a fantastic mastery. If you have it ranked up, every time the opponent drops below 18%, you gain 40% attack and you decrease their defensive ability trigger rate. And also, if the enemy starts the fight below 18%, you gain 30% offensive ability trigger rate. And that does happen sometimes where the opponent starts to fight below 18%, say in AMs, for example. It's a really good mastery overall because it's useful in every fight, and the attack boost is really noticeable. So if you have it maxed out, or at least at rank, say 4, for example, when the enemy drops below 18%, you do see a real difference. Your specials are stronger, you land more crits, you do more damage. It's really good. Now, somebody could counter and say, well, why bother with it? Because once the enemy is below 18% health, the fight is almost over. But the thing is that, again, in difficult content, in high-level AMs, for example, the opponent can do a lot of damage to you when they're at 10 or 15% health. And so it's just a really nice boost. It helps you to finish the fight more quickly and more cleanly. So I would put at least a few points into it, if not max it out. And so that leads then to the final tree. We have Despair here. Most people just put a point into it if they plan on using deep wounds. If you don't use deep wounds, Despair really isn't necessary. It just reduces a bot's healing and repair when they are debuffed. It's not a big deal. But if you do want to use deep wounds, you should put a point into Despair. And deep wounds is fantastic if and only if you use bleed bots a lot. So if you're using bots like RC and Windy, Drift, Bone Crusher, Necro, OGP, MV1, Cheetor, all the major bleeders, Deep Wounds is fantastic. It increases the duration of bleeds, which in many cases will add a few seconds to your bleeds. It also strikes down an average of 1% health from the opponent when you have more health than them. And it will activate very frequently because a lot of these bots bleed all the time. So it's a really useful mastery. It activates constantly, and it's noticeable. You really do see it when you bring a bleed bot into a fight. It does not need to be maxed out for sure because it doesn't scale. So you get 5% additional duration of bleeds per rank. So I would say rank 3 and up is great. Mine's at rank 4. I'm very happy with that. It does its job. So if you love the bleed bots, I would definitely use it. If you don't have to bother with it. And so that brings us to the final 2 masteries. We have the stun masteries, which are suppression, where opponents will trigger fewer abilities and repair less while they're stunned. Like Despair, most people will put a single point in this simply to unlock Stupefy. So Stupefy is a stun duration mastery. It is good. However, you have to bear in mind that it really needs to be ranked up because even at rank 5, you're only getting an additional 0.8 seconds of stun. It's not even a full second. So if you only took this to rank 1 or 2, it wouldn't make any difference at all, really. But at rank 5, you do have almost an extra second of stun for every stun. And so it's really useful if you love the stun bots. So if you use bots like Ramjet, Wheeljack, Soundwave, Prowl, Windblade, any Bludgeon, any of these bots that stun a lot, this could be worthwhile for you. But you have to think about it, though, because you will need to use a total of 6 points to rank it up. That's a lot of points. So you'd have to think about that. I would like to try it sometime. I know a few people who do use it and they like it. So it's a situational mastery, but it could be good if stun bots are central to your team. So that's about it. That's my overview. Like I said, don't copy anyone's mastery setup, including mine. You don't have to worry about the perfect setup, but if you focus on some of these masteries like Sequencer and Courage and the crit damage masteries, Star Seeker, Assassin, the masteries that are going to benefit all of your bots, you focus on those first. Then you can be very deliberate about where you put your remaining points. And if you do that, it'll make a real difference in your gameplay, especially in that higher level, more difficult content. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. And I will see you all next time. So take care, and I'll talk to you later.